He wore a crown of gold but died with a mouthful of foam. King George III was no longer king by the end. He was a blind, shrieking remnant of a man, locked away like a secret too shameful to share. His family abandoned him. His doctors feared him, and his own mind, once brilliant, became the architect of his agony. In those final days, there were no royal banquets, only silence, rot, and screams that echoed through Windsor's stone walls. King George III was once the symbol of power, a monarch whose voice shaped empires and whose decisions could ripple across continents. But by the time the year 1810 arrived, his voice no longer commanded armies. It trembled, cracked, and muttered words no one could understand. Inside Windsor Castle, the man who once wore the crown of Britain now wandered its corridors in silence. His robes, once regal and pristine, hung loosely from his frame. He barely ate, he barely slept, but he talked constantly, to himself, to the shadows, sometimes to no one at all. Servants were instructed not to speak of what they saw, but whispers spread like fire through stone. George had begun holding long conversations in empty rooms. He sang hymns under his breath that shifted into curses. He burst into laughter without reason, and when asked who he was speaking to, he often smiled faintly and replied, "You wouldn't understand. They're not for your ears." There were days when he believed he was a farmer again, out in the fields with hay on his hands. And then, within minutes, he'd revert to thinking he was meeting with Parliament. He issued orders to invisible generals, signed fake declarations, and saluted portraits that didn't move. His family, though deeply affected, kept their distance. The government was already preparing a Regency Act. The court physicians were helpless. Some claimed he was possessed. Others insisted it was madness passed through blood. But one thing was certain: King George III was fading, not from disease of the body, but from a torment of the mind. The walls of Windsor had become his prison, but to him, they were a battlefield, a chapel, a childhood home, and a courtroom all at once. His reality twisted by forces no one could see. He was slipping, inch by inch, into a place where no crown could follow. But what the servants began whispering about at night was far more terrifying than any royal decree, because behind closed doors, the king had started to talk to someone who wasn't there. The halls of Windsor Castle had always been quiet after sunset, but now they pulsed with something different, something colder. Servants who once moved confidently through the corridors now walked with lowered eyes and quickened steps. They spoke in whispers and crossed themselves when no one was looking, because something was wrong inside those walls, and it wasn't just the king's mind unraveling. The echoes started subtly, a distant knocking in the middle of the night, footsteps on marble floors when no one was there, doors creaking open in perfect silence, without wind or reason. At first, the staff dismissed them as the tricks of an old castle, but it became harder to ignore when the king began answering voices that didn't exist. Some nights, George would sit in the dark of his private chamber, nodding thoughtfully, muttering replies to thin air. Other nights, he argued loudly, violently with shadows. He screamed at walls, threw cups, cursed names no one had spoken in decades. And worst of all, he sometimes wept and apologized. To Charlotte, he whispered, clawing at the floor, "Forgive me, my love. I didn't mean to leave the children." The doctors came and went, prescribing leeches, bleeding, and rest, but nothing soothed him. One maid swore she heard him laugh into voices at once. Another claimed she saw him speaking to an empty chair, tears running down his cheeks as he recited what sounded like a royal speech. The castle was no longer just a royal residence. It had become something else, a tomb of memories, a maze of madness, a place where time bent itself around the mind of a dying king. The guards outside his room refused to stand too close at night. The nurses began praying aloud during their shifts. Windsor, once the seat of order, had turned into a haunted palace, and in the center of it, a man who was no longer fully alive, but not yet dead. But the real horror was yet to come, because the king's mind wasn't just unraveling, it was starting to tear itself in two. The mind of King George III, once sharp enough to govern an empire, had become a battlefield. Memory and delusion clashed in his skull with no victor. He no longer knew which version of himself he was each morning or who might answer when he opened his mouth. Some days, he awoke certain that he was a boy again. Scolded for misbehaving in the gardens of Kew, he'd ask for his mother, or run panicked from his attendants, insisting that exams were coming. Other times, he believed he was already dead, whispering that the angels had come and taken the throne from him. But the most terrifying episodes were when he was both king and victim, when his mind fractured and two voices emerged. One that issued orders with fury, demanding obedience and sacrifice, and another that begged softly for it all to stop. He would pace the room, barking commands to generals long gone from the earth. He screamed at invisible enemies, accused them of treason, and struck out at anyone who dared approach. Then suddenly, without warning, he'd collapse into tears and plead for forgiveness from shadows no one could see. One physician described it as watching a man possessed by his own memories. The line between past and present, between real and imagined, had dissolved completely. At times, George seemed to speak in tongues, muttering phrases in Latin, French, and broken English. He would curse Parliament in one breath and weep for the colonies in the next. He forgot the names of his daughters, then remembered them, then forgot again. He believed his wife Charlotte was still alive and nearby, though she had died years before. One night, he stood outside his chamber door, waiting with a bouquet of dead flowers, murmuring, "She'll forgive me if I smile." The doctors were helpless, their tools leeches. Purgatives, restraints could not mend a shattered identity, and so they began to write. In journals and medical logs, they documented each horrifying spiral as if cataloging a descent into hell. They noted that his pupils were dilated even in darkness, that he often flinched at sudden silence, that he had begun holding conversations with his reflection, sometimes arguing with it. The mirror, it seemed, had become both witness and tormentor. Even the king's own son, now Prince Regent, struggled to visit him. George barely recognized him. When he did, he accused him of plotting betrayal. Once, he screamed that the crown was poisoned. Another time, he tried to crown the prince with a bowl of porridge. The royal court knew the truth. Their king had become a stranger, not just to them, but to himself. His mind had split beyond recognition, and the fragments were sharp enough to cut anyone who got too close. But what no one expected was that the palace would soon become his cage, because the king was no longer safe to be seen. And Windsor would not remain a home, it would become a padded cell, a golden prison, where echoes of madness would never die. By 1811, the transformation was complete. Windsor Castle, once a sanctuary of royal elegance, had become the padded cage of a man who could no longer rule or even recognize himself. King George III, stripped of his authority by the Regency Act, no longer wore his crown. In fact, he couldn't bear the sight of it. He screamed whenever he saw it polished. Once, he tried to flush one of its replicas down the lavatory, insisting it whispered lies. The Prince of Wales had taken the reins of power, now officially serving as Prince Regent. Behind closed doors, he mourned a father who still breathed, but no longer existed. And yet, there was no funeral, no farewell, no closure. Only a living ghost who wandered the castle grounds under supervision, speaking to trees and weeping at statues. George was confined to a select wing of Windsor. The windows were reinforced, the furniture softened or removed, mirrors were covered. Guards were placed at every entrance, not to protect the king, but to protect everyone else from him. On better days, he would sit by the window humming softly, watching birds fly past with a child's fascination. He would speak of God, of virtue, of duties he must fulfill, but those days were rare. Most of the time, he was either raging or retreating, cycling between violent outbursts and vacant stares. He tore curtains from their rails, believing they were traitors hiding in the folds. He refused to eat food unless it was served by a servant he trusted, and even then, he'd sometimes fling it against the wall, crying that it was poisoned. Nurses had to be rotated constantly. He grew suspicious of familiar faces. "You've been replaced," he muttered once to a longtime attendant. "The real you is dead. You're just wearing his skin." At night, he often howled in his sleep. Not groans, not murmurs, howls, deep, guttural, primal. The kind of sound that makes even hardened guards grip their spears tighter. Some claimed They heard him speaking in full conversation, sometimes rational, sometimes in babble, but always with someone who wasn't in the room. Letters from the royal physicians became more desperate. His Majesty is beyond the reach of reason. One wrote, he believes the birds are spies. He refers to the moon as his mother. He no longer understands he is king, and yet, somewhere within the shattered ruin of a monarch, flickers of lucidity would flare. A phrase, a gesture, a moment of heartbreaking clarity. Once he took a page of parchment and began to write an apology to Charlotte, his late queen. The words were coherent, poetic even, but by the time the ink dried, he had forgotten he'd written it. When they showed it to him, he accused the staff of forging his hand. Windsor became a paradox, both his refuge and his prison. It kept him safe from the outside world, and the outside world safe from him. Visitors were few. Royal life continued. Without him, Parliament met, wars were fought, Britain evolved. But within those castle walls, time stood still. There were no more portraits being painted, no more speeches, no more signatures, just a man in a frayed nightshirt, screaming into the void, while the kingdom he once ruled pretended he was merely resting. But the walls couldn't contain everything. Because soon, the king would no longer be alone in his madness. Someone or something was about to answer him back. Windsor Castle had always been full of echoes of grand banquets, royal decrees, and generations of sovereigns whose footsteps were etched into the stone. But in the final years of King George III's life, those echoes took on a darker tone. They began to speak back. What began as whispers in the corner of his mind grew into full voices, familiar, accusing, impossible. The king no longer spoke to shadows. He spoke to people who had long since passed from the world of the living. He claimed to see his daughter Amelia standing at the foot of his bed, weeping. She had died years earlier, but George insisted she came to him nightly, sometimes silent, sometimes sobbing. Once, a maid overheard him singing to her, rocking gently in his chair as if cradling a child. He began to call out to his ancestors. He addressed the long-dead Henry VIII with reverence, asking for guidance. He whispered apologies to Elizabeth I, mumbling that he had failed her legacy. Sometimes he would stand in the corridor, bowing his head as if listening to royal judgment from beyond the veil. The castle's staff, already worn thin by years of madness, now avoided certain rooms after sunset. One chambermaid refused to enter the king's study ever again. She claimed she saw a shadow standing behind the king, tall, unmoving, and blacker than the dark itself. The king looked straight at it, smiled, and said, "Ah, father, I've been expecting you." He grew obsessed with time. Clocks in his room were smashed or stopped at the hour of his daughter's death. When they tried to bring new ones, he'd rip them apart. "Time betrayed me," he shouted once. It took her. It took them all. His conversations with these apparitions became routine, sometimes gentle, other times furious. He berated them for past mistakes, accused them of orchestrating his downfall. He screamed at his own reflection, believing it was the ghost of King George II taunting him from beyond. But the worst came one stormy evening, when the castle grounds flooded and thunder cracked the night sky. A guard passing by the king's room heard a deep, resonant voice, clear, calm, and unfamiliar. It wasn't the king's, yet there was no one else inside. When the door was unlocked, George was standing motionless, staring at the ceiling, tears running down his face. "They forgive me now," he whispered, "but I cannot forgive myself." Whatever haunted him in those final years wasn't just guilt or madness. It was something deeper. The weight of history pressing down on his skull, the sins of kings before him, the agony of outliving his children, his wife, and his mind. It all coiled around him like a crown of thorns, heavy with regret. His advisors dismissed it all as hallucination. The royal court avoided the subject. But within Windsor, among those who served him, a silent truth was shared. King George III was no longer alone in his madness. The ghosts of the crown had come home, and in the middle of it all, a broken king stood trembling, waiting for their final judgment. But outside the castle, in the heart of Parliament, another kind of judgment was already taking shape, and it would wound him in ways the spirits never could. In the grand halls of Westminster, The kingdom continued to function as if its king had already died. And in many ways, he had. The king's madness was no longer a whispered rumor. It was a matter of law. In February 1811, Parliament enacted the Regency Act. It was official. George III was declared unfit to rule. His eldest son, George, the flamboyant Prince of Wales, became Prince Regent. The crown still sat upon the old king's head and title, but the scepter had passed into different hands. The decision sent tremors through the monarchy. For centuries, the divine right of kings had ruled England. Kings could be cruel, they could be corrupt, but to be mad, that was a terrifying precedent. A monarch whose mind had unraveled was not a ruler, he was a symbol of collapse. And so, the nation did what it always did with uncomfortable truths: it buried them. King George III became a national embarrassment. His name was avoided in public speech. Royal portraits of him were quietly removed. No state visits, no decrees, no letters. The once revered monarch was now an absent figure, hidden behind high walls and heavy curtains. But within those walls, George still breathed, and though his mind fractured further each day, it clung desperately to the one role that still haunted him, that of a father. He called for his sons, one by one. Most did not come. The pain of seeing their father in such a state, babbling, shaking, sometimes snarling like an animal, was too much to bear. When they did visit, George often didn't recognize them. Worse, he mistook them for childhood friends or long-dead courtiers. His most heartbreaking moments were reserved for Amelia, his youngest and most beloved daughter. She had died in 1810, but to George, she was still alive, just out of reach. He spoke to her constantly, begged for her forgiveness, promised her ponies, dolls, and sunlight. He blamed himself for her death. He believed that God had taken her as punishment for his failures. At night, the staff would find him curled in corners, clutching faded letters she had once written, repeating her name over and over like a hymn. "Melia, my darling Melia, please don't go today." His voice would crack, sometimes vanish into a dry whisper, and then he would begin to hum lullabies only he remembered. His grief was boundless, tangled with delusion, but at its core was something deeply human. Beneath the madness, beneath the royal titles and ancient bloodlines, was a father mourning his child, and his kingdom had no place for that kind of pain. Outside the palace, the press began mocking the monarch. Satirical cartoons showed the mad king locked in a room with padded walls and a golden dunce cap. Pamphlets joked about the King of England talking to ghosts. They didn't see the man clawing at the floor, begging for his daughter's voice. They didn't see the tears soaking his nightshirt. The British Empire marched forward toward industry, expansion, and war. But in the heart of Windsor, a father mourned, not with words, but with silence, with confusion, with madness. His heart had broken in places that medicine could never touch. And as his family ruled in his name, they never spoke of the agony they left behind. But grief was only the beginning. His body would follow where his mind had gone into darkness, because what awaited him next was more terrifying than madness itself. It was the slow, cruel death of the senses. As the mind of King George III collapsed, so too did his body. It began with a dull ache behind the eyes, nothing unusual for a man in his 70s. But as weeks passed, the world around him started to dim. Candles seemed weaker, sunlight lost its warmth, faces blurred. Books, once his solace, became unreadable. At first, he blamed the servants for drawing the curtains too tight, but soon he could no longer see the curtains at all. By 1812, he was almost completely blind. For a man who had spent his youth poring over texts, walking his gardens, watching musicians and painters bring beauty to life, this was its own kind of death. The darkness swallowed what little of the world he still understood. Shadows were no longer imagined fears, they were everything. Stripped of his sight, George was now utterly cut off. Conversations became confusing echoes. He misread tones. He spoke into silence. When he smiled, no one knew why. When he wept, no one could tell if he even knew they were there. The sounds of the castle, once distant, now surrounded him, alive with menace. He mistook footsteps for threats, the rustle of fabric for whispers, the chime of a clock for a scream. His isolation deepened, not just in space, but in spirit. Windsor Castle was no longer a prison. It was a void that no more visitors came. Even his physicians had grown quiet. They spoke to each other in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact as if guilt alone might infect them. Nurses entered and exited with robotic calm, administering treatments with no hope of healing. To them, he was no longer a king, not even a man, just a shadow wrapped in flesh. George's days were spent sitting for hours in silence, rocking gently, humming broken melodies. Sometimes he would mutter phrases under his breath, sentences that began with clarity and dissolved into nonsense. Other times, he screamed loud, blood-curdling screams that echoed through the stone halls. And no one came. He could no longer read letters or see the faces of those who betrayed or loved him, but he could remember them. He would trace the air in front of him, as if sketching their silhouettes. He spoke to Amelia as if she were in the room, always at the same place, 2 paces in front, to the left. Melia. He'd say softly, "Don't step in the dark. Stay where the violets grow." He believed the castle had changed shape, that it was growing, twisting, alive. He claimed the walls were closing in, that doors had moved. He became terrified of his own bed, insisting it breathed when he wasn't looking. The blindness had not removed the madness, it had magnified it. And yet, some part of him fought to understand. One night, a nurse recorded hearing him whisper, "I used to be someone. I was loud. They listened. I wore the sun on my chest and walked among gods. But now, I don't know what I am. I think I'm still here, but I can't find me." The words shook her. She never returned to his wing. He had lost his crown. He had lost his mind. And now, he had lost the light. But the worst was still to come, because even without sight, he would soon see something no man should, something that would push him past madness into something monstrous. By the time George III was blind and locked within the shrinking boundaries of his own body, the last remaining barrier broke. His voice. It had once been a voice of command, the voice that rallied a nation during war, that delivered royal speeches with gravity and grace. But now, it had become something primal, stripped of reason. It spoke only in instinct and pain. The servants called him the Screaming King. It started at night, muffled cries at first, guttural, hoarse, but they soon escalated into full-blown howls and human sounds that echoed through Windsor Castle like a dying beast. No one could ignore them. Not the guards stationed at the gates, not the kitchen staff 3 floors below. The screams pierced every wall, every corridor, every dream. Sometimes they were single, guttural wails. Other times, they came in waves, long, drawn-out shrieks punctuated by whimpering. And at times, he would shriek a single word over and over. "No, stop, liar, Melia." When anyone tried to enter the room, he grew violent. He clawed, kicked, bit. One attendant lost a portion of his ear. Another was hospitalized after George drove a sharpened quill into his neck. The old king no longer recognized faces or language, only threat and confusion. The only thing more terrifying than his rage was his laughter. He would sit in silence for hours, and then suddenly erupt into manic laughter, high-pitched, relentless, broken. The sound unsettled even the most experienced caretakers. There was something inhuman about it, like a child mocking a funeral, a joyless, twisted amusement that came from a place no one could reach. Windsor Castle shifted in tone. The paintings were removed from the king's wing, tapestries pulled down, the grand chandeliers dimmed. Everything that once marked the opulence of monarchy was stripped away from his presence. They hoped it would calm him. It didn't. He spoke of men with bird faces watching him from the rafters. He said the walls bled at night. He claimed the sun had abandoned him because he lost the war with God. These weren't just illusions, they were obsessions. Ritualistic, repetitive, unshakable. One nurse recalled him shrieking at the fireplace, convinced that it had opened to reveal the gates of hell. "They're coming," he cried. "The flames, don't let them drag me. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." The doctors stopped calling it madness. They began calling it possession. Not in the spiritual sense, but in the way a body can be occupied by something so broken, so tormented, that no original self remains. And somewhere deep within the ruin of George, the last spark of identity flickered out. He no longer answered to his name. He no longer knew the year. He no longer remembered being king. To the world beyond Windsor, he was gone, a relic, a memory, a shameful secret in a golden prison. But to those inside the castle, he was a living nightmare, a man who had descended beneath madness into something primal, something dangerous. He didn't just lose his mind, he became the embodiment of its collapse. By now, even his screams had changed. They weren't expressions of pain or confusion. They were declarations of fear, of guilt, of warning. As if he saw something no one else could. As if something was waiting. And soon, he would be silent, not because the horror ended, but because his voice would finally fail him. Because before death came for the king, the silence did, and in that silence, the empire began to forget him. By the winter of 1819, the British Empire was rising to new heights. Abroad, British armies expanded their influence. At home, the seeds of industry and reform pushed the nation toward a new future. In Parliament, voices argued over trade, power, and legacy. But one voice had long since vanished. The voice of the king. George III still lived, if breathing counted as living. But his throne, once the center of British identity, was now a hollow symbol, a chair with no owner, a crown resting in silence. The monarch remained alive in name only, spoken of occasionally, pitied rarely, and remembered by few. He had not been seen in public for years. No portraits were updated, no speeches given. His name was absent from royal documents, and the Prince Regent, who ruled in his place, had become king in all but title. George's image, once engraved in coins and displayed in every court, was fading like ink exposed to sun. Inside Windsor, he was still technically sovereign, but the man himself had wasted away. He no longer screamed, not because the madness had passed, but because it had taken everything from him: his voice, his energy, even his reactions. He no longer flinched at footsteps. He no longer spoke to shadows. He merely sat, slumped in his chair, thin and pale, with eyes that stared at nothing. His beard unkempt, his fingernails cracked and discolored, his frame shrinking beneath the heavy robes once fit for a ruler. The same man who had held court over a global empire now couldn't hold his spoon. Most days, he didn't eat unless coaxed. Some days, he refused to be touched. The nurses had learned to work around his silence. They washed him like a statue, dressed him like a doll, and when he occasionally moved or muttered, they paused, half in hope, half in dread. It had been nearly a decade since he last held a pen. The man who once drafted essays, wrote detailed royal correspondence, and annotated scripture, now couldn't form a single sentence. His hands shook constantly. Even when still, his breathing, shallow and uneven, filled the quiet rooms with a kind of metronome, a reminder that the king still lived, though barely. Those who served him began to see him as something other than human. They called him the Shade, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left behind his eyes, only a vague, flickering awareness that surfaced at random. Sometimes he cried, soft, sudden, inexplicable tears. No one knew what memories remained. If he remembered the loss of America, if he remembered Charlotte or Amelia, if he even knew he had once been a king. One morning, as the sun broke through the windows, a young servant said something that no one corrected. "He looks like a ghost who doesn't know he's dead." The castle agreed. George no longer seemed to exist in the same world. He had become the echo of monarchy, a breathing shadow, a man erased before death. And yet, the kingdom moved on. The government restructured. The prince reveled in his role. History began to forget the man who had ruled it for 6 decades. The throne was never officially declared empty, but in truth, it had been hollow for years. Even his enemies had stopped mocking him. What was the point? The Mad King had long been replaced by the Silent One, and silence, more than madness, terrified them. But death was patient. And in his final days, as his body prepared to surrender, something flickered in the corners of the room. Not memories, not spirits, a reckoning. Because the last breath of the king would not pass quietly. In that final moment, all the ghosts, all the grief, all the horrors would return to claim him. January 29, 1820. There was no parade, No procession of mourners, no national moment of silence. The announcement came softly, folded between reports of weather and politics. His Majesty King George III has passed, but those closest to him knew the truth. The king had died long before the world acknowledged it. His body was discovered just before dawn, slouched in his chair beside the window, eyes shut, mouth slightly open, as if caught mid-sentence. No cries, no final gasps, just stillness. After a decade of madness, silence had finally won. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lavender, a desperate attempt to mask the scent of age and decay. A thin blanket was draped over his knees. In his hand, loosely clenched, was a letter faded and unreadable. No one could tell if he had written it, or if he'd even known what it was. There was no one with him when he passed. No family, no priests, just the ghosts. For days, the staff had noticed something strange. The king had stopped speaking entirely, even in gibberish. He had gone mute. His final week was spent in silence, occasionally nodding, sometimes crying. A doctor had said it was a mercy. Others weren't so sure. Some believed he had won. Last vision, the day before he died, a nurse claimed to see him reach into the air, eyes wide. Trembling, he whispered something unintelligible, and then he smiled. A real, soft, peaceful smile. The first in years. It was the expression of a man seeing something he had waited decades to find. Maybe it was Amelia. Maybe it was Charlotte. Maybe it was the throne, finally empty. The funeral was held with modest dignity, far smaller than the grand affairs once imagined for a reigning monarch. By the time he was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the world had already moved on. His son had been king in all but name for years. His reign was already being rewritten. They called him mad. They called him misunderstood. They called him a tragedy. But none of those names truly captured what was lost. Because what died with George III wasn't just a man. It was memory. The memory of a king who once walked through cheering crowds. The memory of a father who kissed his children goodnight. The memory of a nation's soul, cracked and scattered in the mind of a man who forgot his own name. There would be no final words etched into history. No farewell speech, just fading ink and forgotten journals. Echoing footsteps in a palace that had grown to quiet. And the hush of a man erased by his own mind. His legacy would be debated, his illness studied, but his humanity, his suffering was quietly buried with him. Years later, one visitor to Windsor stood in the now empty chamber where George had spent his final decade. They looked around at the cold stone, the tall windows, the silence, and whispered, "History remembers kings for their power, but no one remembers how they suffer." Maybe that's how George would have wanted it. Or maybe he would have begged us to remember everything, even the madness, even the screams, even the silence, because in the end, all that remained of the king was this: a name carved in stone, a crown passed on, and a shadow still lingering in Windsor's darkest wing. In forgetting George III, Britain buried more than a monarch. It buried a man who died long before his final breath.